Hi everyone, my name is Megan Phillips, and this is part one of your professional development on racism. Hopefully everyone was able to watch the TED Talk by Paul Rucker, The Symbols of Systemic Racism and How to Do Away with Your Power. It was about the normalization of racism today and how we can dismantle slavery. Before we begin, I would like for you to talk with your teammates about what you think racism is and how you would define it. I wanted to share 3 definitions with you. The first one is race. It's socially constructed, like gender and disability. It is not biological, like your sexuality, athleticism, if you are good at art, or if you're a soccer star. Very, very different. It's created and reinforced by social and institutional norms and practices and by individual attitudes and behavior. Racism within the United States. White racial and cultural prejudice and discrimination supported intentionally or unintentionally by institutional power and authority, and used to the advantage of whites and disadvantage of people of color. It's a form of oppression in which one racial group dominates over others. While we're talking about what racism is, I also want to talk about what it's not. And when we think about racism, I don't want us to be thinking that it's individual, isolated acts committed by really, really, really bad people a long, long time ago. No, it lives in every single institution in our society today. And the last one is cultural racism. The cultural images and messages that affirm the assumed superiority of whites and the assumed inferiority of people of color. So some examples of that's the mainstream media and some jokes, stereotypes, and accomplishments. So how did we get here? As we all know, the United States was founded on an economy of enslavement of Africans and indigenous people and the genocide of indigenous people. So for a country who is forming because of equality and everyone having rights, Thomas Jefferson, who owned hundreds of slaves, really wanted everyone to accept that there were natural differences amongst us and that there was a natural racial hierarchy. So he really needed some justification for enslavement. So during this time period, science was focused on really proving that race was biological. So that means, they were measuring different skulls, trying to find differences amongst us. They're not, right? Race is not biological. So slavery becomes illegal, and we know that once slavery was abolished, racism wasn't, right? It continues, and it kind of takes a different shape. What it looked like after that was limitations on citizenship and what whiteness was. So that was restricting voting, property rights, and the exploitation of labor. Racism changes, different forms through different eras. So when we look at our early immigrants, which were, Irish, Italian, Jewish immigrants, they were met with a lot of resistance and a lot of racism, but as they assimilated into dominant culture, then they became white. And as time goes on and it takes on different forms, it's always trying to preserve whiteness. And we know what that looks like today. That's us having a travel ban from certain Muslim countries. Where are we building a border wall when there's another country that also borders the United States? No, we're building a border wall in Mexico. So racism exists, and it always has existed within the United States, and it's changing, and it changes and takes different shapes through different eras. We're going to pause and talk. Do you think racism still exists today? What's the evidence around you that shows that it does? And what institutions might racism still exist in? We could talk for days about racism within our institutions. I'm going to provide some quick examples within a few of our institutions. This will just be very brief. So the first one is our criminal justice system. The United States has the highest prison rate in the world. 2.2 million people are in prison here. 900,000 of those are Black. And if you could see this little graph here, I apologize, it's kind of small. 1 out of 3 Black men born in 2007 is expected to be in prison at some point in their life. 1 out of 6 Hispanic men is expected to be in prison at some point of their life. The Department of Justice did a study and they discovered that Black men are 3 times more likely to be stopped and searched while they're driving. Yet white men are 4 times as likely to have an illegal substance while they're driving. They say that our criminal justice system is modern day slavery. And if you look, it's a disproportionate number of Black men and Latino men in our prisons. They're overrepresented for the number that they actually are within our population, overrepresented within the criminal justice system. When we look at housing, there is a lot of racial bias in home lending. The Federal Reserve Bank of Boston did a study and discovered that Black and Latino mortgages are 60% more likely to be denied. The segregation that's happening with our housing is also really has a direct impact on our school systems as well. The biggest factor with the housing market and how mainstream banks are decreasing and denying loans for Black and Latino and other minoritized groups, that allows other lenders to take those loans and give them ridiculously high interest rates, which doesn't allow for them to have a property with a higher value because they're strapped with high interest rate loans. But the biggest factor behind all this is their net worth. So they're being denied loans because it doesn't matter how much money they currently have there, because of all of the oppression that they faced in the past, that's having a direct impact on what they're able to do today. Health. Minoritized groups have higher rates of poverty and lower earnings, which contributes to higher rates of chronic disease. So we're going to see a direct correlation between health and wealth, similar to the one with housing and education. There is a lower HDI compared to the general population. Now let's go ahead and move into the economy. I have 2 graphs here. The first one is the 2006 family median incomes, and we can see that the lowest income is for Black families at $35,000. The highest is that of white families. And that's a very big difference amongst them. The Latino family is just a few thousand more than the Black family median income. When we look at 2008 poverty rates, we know that whites have the lowest poverty rate by population. Asians 11%, Hispanics 23%, and Blacks 24%. Now, your wealth directly impacts your health. That's why I put these 2 on the same side. So the amount of money you have directly impacts your life expectancy, your mental health. There's correlations with infant mortality, with disease, physical disabilities, nutritional deficiencies, heart disease, mental illness, arthritis. And as we're seeing, when we're talking about your wealth affecting your health, who are the poorest people in our country? So again, you can see that they're overrepresented when we are discussing poverty rates, and when we're looking at poor health, the minoritized groups really have a lot higher rates than white families do. Okay, let's go ahead and pause and talk. Do you think racism exists within our school systems today? How so? So, segregation has been illegal for 65 years. Yet schools today are just as segregated as they were before it was illegal. When we look at the relationship between school segregation, funding, and equality, we know that wherever there are more white students, that's where the AP classes are. That's where the gifted classes are. Our curriculums are dominated by standardized tests, and who's creating the standardized tests? Who are those serving? Those standardized tests also focus on individual achievement. And when we look at our charter schools and choice schools, these schools are extensions of our community, and as they pull students from their community schools, it's less focus, less resources directed to schools that need it. When we think about curriculum, standardized tests, charter schools, choice schools, those are new forms of educational racism, and they're just increasing the amount of inequality that's already here, thanks to everything with the housing market and the segregation within that. If we pretend that we don't notice race, we cannot notice racism. If we do not notice racism, we cannot understand or interrupt it within ourselves or others. Racism really is not being talked about within our schools. It's not within our curriculum, except it's completely embedded within the curriculum, but no mention of how we can question it and that we're not preparing our students with any of the tools that they need to be able to fight this and combat this within our education system and the other institutions. And we're going to talk so much more about racism in education. Very quickly, this is from a map that I pulled, and this is just focusing on North Carolina. If you visit this website, it's every state in the United States. And here this shares, we have our non-white students who get free and reduced lunch. And then the blue is focusing on discipline with our Black students and the number of times they're more likely to be suspended compared to our white students. They're 3.3 times more likely. And then we also have our times likely for opportunity. And then our yellow is for our Hispanic students. And we can see, again, there are huge differences. And at the very last, I have a quote that I read. It was discussing the criminal justice system, and it says, if we consider historical, institutional, and cultural racism, the explanation looks very different. Many incarcerated people of color have attended underfunded and deteriorating schools, have had poor access to health care, have historically been denied mortgages and other wealth-building programs. They have received inequitable treatment in every other major institution that would have given them and their children an equal starting point in life. I feel like oftentimes we just look at something like our criminal justice system